Technologies of the Soul. The Fight for Futures Past. By Elton Gar. Mirabel had turned 18 3 weeks ago. That meant that she was an adult, so this was the first opportunity she had to make decisions without her parents' approval.
It's just a bad idea,
her mother said. She had used ReMem when Mirabel had been a child, and it hadn't been great. But the real problem had been her father, who had regained the memories of his previous life as a Nazi soldier. He wasn't the worst, and he tried hard to overcome it, but having the memories of someone who had grown up and lived in Nazi society had changed him and ultimately led to the end of their marriage. To give credit to her father, he was more against ReMem than his ex-wife and had taken years of therapy to overcome those memories. But Mirabel knew a lot of people who had gone through the procedure and come out better too. With parents' permission, you could get the procedure as young as 13, and if you were lucky, you might not only get out of high school, but have a college degree. Mirabel stood in front of the building, which was built to look somewhere between a hospital and a cathedral. That was because it was both definitive proof that the soul existed and the most advanced science ever created. But once you went inside, it was far more like a bank. She moved to the end of a line that wove between velvet ropes, and when she got to the front, she walked up to a bored-looking guy who said,
"Name and age."
Mirabel Smith, age 18.
Mirabel said.
"And why are you here today?"
I have a ReMem appointment.
Mirabel said.
"Do you have an appointment?"
The boy said, clearly not paying any attention to her and reminding her that while this was the most important moment of her life, it was just another day to him and a way for a massive corporation to make money.
Yes. I am here for ReMem,
Mirabel said. He mumbled something, then handed her a clipboard. She waited a minute for instructions, then took it and went and sat down. The clipboard was filled with forms that needed to be filled out. The first simply explained that ReMem wasn't responsible for any outcomes based on the procedure working correctly. That was probably reasonable, since they had been sued several times by people who didn't like the memories they had regained. There were also several financial statements. If for any reason you didn't gain any past life memories, you only paid a nominal $50. But the price went up dramatically from there, with a cost per past life as well as extra costs based on extra value. When she was done, she went to a different window to give it to an elderly woman who seemed more interested. She looked over the papers carefully, then sent Mirabel to one of the dozens of numbered rooms. After 10 minutes of waiting, a man walked in. He could have been confused with a doctor if you didn't know better. But the only requirement for this job was to look respectable and sound impressive. He did that well enough. He attached electrodes to her head in precise places. She didn't understand that or what exactly was done to her. What she knew was that it made her feel sleepy, and she fell asleep. The dreams were the first signs that ReMem was working. Mirabel's awoke to a flood of memories. As her eyes fluttered open, she looked around the room and felt recognition. She knew this place, or a version of it. There were differences, it was more modern. But the memories of Mirabel and of the new memories worked together to create a clear view. And the reason she knew everything was because she was Dr. Savard, the scientist who had pioneered ReMem technology. He had created the technology to understand the past and expected it to be used by academics and researchers. He had even suggested ways the memories might be removed. Most of that was well known. But what wasn't known was that his death hadn't been a heart attack, or at least not a natural one. The memories of her murder when she was Dr. Savard came so fast it was almost painful. Mirabel sat up, the weight of this knowledge pressing down on her. The technology her predecessor had created and died for was now the key to exposing the corruption he had fought against. She stood up as she realized she needed to run. She started to walk out of the building as she thought through what was happening. The memories were hers, but the supercomputer in the basement created the pathways that allowed them to enter her mind. And even 20 years ago, when Dr. Savard had died, They could pull out enough information as they flowed through the computer to determine the time period, place, and job of the past life. That was, Mirabel added with her more modern knowledge, how they charged people extra for those lives. That meant that they would know Mirabel was not just a client, she was a threat. So far, the other memories had been far less useful. But now that she was trying to escape, the memories for another life became useful. They were oddly reflected memories as she had them not only from the first life, but from Dr. Savard's memories of those memories. It started with living in the ghetto, being forced to wear the armband. She had known when people were put onto buses that it was time to go, so she had fled Germany. That escape had lasted only a few months as she was hidden by people and able to get to safety. But she had learned a few things. One of those things was the look in the eye that she saw on the face of one of the ReMem security guards. Luckily, unlike the men Leah had seen in Germany, he wasn't armed and she was able to run. The man followed, but the combinations of memories worked together. This facility was new, but its design was similar enough to ones he had worked in that Dr. Savard knew which hallways were likely to be unused. 2 quick turns later, she rushed out an emergency exit onto a side street. Knowing the alarm was likely sounding, she continued to run. Mirabel's heart pounded in her chest, each step echoing the urgency of her newfound purpose. She darted through the maze of city streets, blending into the crowd yet feeling utterly isolated. It wasn't that allowing a corrupt corporation to control such an important technology had regressed society in 100 different ways. She was already beginning to feel some of that, and knew that it wasn't as black and white as it might seem. The past was almost universally less free and more violent, but yet a lot of people, in specific groups, had felt safer and more free.
Yes, ignorance is often bliss,
Mirabel said, speaking out loud, an idea that Dr. Savard had often said when discussing ReMem and the costs. It didn't really matter. There was no way to undo the damage done by ReMem, but perhaps she could limit the damage it did in the future. It would take time to integrate these different versions of herself. But as difficult as their different lives were, they still felt like Mirabel. These were the memories of other people, but they also weren't other people. Their minds were too familiar for that. Once she was certain no one was following her, she considered where to go. That was a problem. If the ReMem Corporation was looking for her, she couldn't go home. But none of her other memories were from this city. She almost walked into one of the small bars before she remembered she was 18 and getting thrown out of a bar wouldn't help her stay hidden. But as she looked in the window, she saw one of the TVs switch from a baseball game to her face. Below it, the caption said, "Escaped with dangerous memories of a terrorist. Report if seen." Warnings like that weren't common. Most of the time, when people had memories from dangerous people, they were put under observation and given free psychiatric help for as long as it was needed. But the truth was that in most cases, without the circumstances that had driven them to violence, they became far less dangerous. Now that everyone was looking for her, she really needed help. And while she didn't like to burden them, the obvious group of people to go to were the others with memories of World War II Germany. Most of them, even people like her father who had been on the wrong side of that war, were cautious of government overreach and the powerful, and very few of them would ever turn someone over to the authorities, no matter the reason. Finding them wasn't all that difficult. There were support groups all over the city. The only real requirement was that you spoke German or Yiddish, though that would be waived when necessary. She sat in a circle with stale coffee and a homemade Mandelbrot. That she knew what the small, crunchy cookie was and preferred it to the Rugelach reminded her just how much the memories were influencing her. The meeting felt more like an AA meeting than felt appropriate, though as people got up and talked about the horrible things that they had done or had done to them in a previous life, she understood. She was beginning to think that in addition to coming back, she might need to find an AA meeting too, since Dr. Savard had gone to one every week for 20 years. That was when a 30-year-old woman who had just finished talking about having shot escaping prisoners turned to her and said,
"Would you like to say anything?"
She almost said no, But then Mirabel remembered she hadn't just come here to deal with a troubling past life in Germany. She was here because of the murder of Dr. Savard and the attempts to catch her, so she said,
I got ReMem this afternoon. My parents forbade it before I was 18. Turns out they were right. Though I don't think anyone would have predicted what happened.
She considered holding back, but she was asking these people for help. She couldn't imagine doing that without explaining everything. The group listened silently as Mirabel recounted the conspiracy and danger surrounding Dr. Savard's death, and how the knowledge she now possessed made her a target. Yet here, in this circle of souls marred by history's darkest chapters, she found a glimmer of hope. The woman who had spoken of executing prisoners nodded solemnly, understanding dawning in her eyes.
We've all carried burdens from our past lives.
She said softly.
But you might get to do something about it.
Discussions followed, whispers of strategies and plans, of support networks that existed in the shadows, places where Mirabel could hide, and allies who could help her bring the truth to light. They spoke in coded language, the kind learned in times of war and oppression, a language of survival and resistance. Mirabel listened, absorbing every word, every offer of assistance. Her journey had led her here, to this unlikely sanctuary, and she felt a strange sense of belonging. These were her people now, not by blood but by shared destiny. As the meeting drew to a close, and the group began to disperse into the night, Mirabel stayed seated, lost in thought as well as the understanding she had no place to go. She was thinking about getting another cup of coffee when a 25-year-old man approached her. He had grown his hair out to hang over a tattoo, but when he moved his hair she saw the skull in German words. He saw her and said,
Yeah, that was before. But I think we knew each other. I helped hide people during the war. Were you Leah?
She hadn't said the name, but it was hers, and there was an earnestness in the young man's eyes, so she said,
Yes. Leah Katz.
Well then, perhaps there is something poetic about me giving you someplace to hide again.
Something was stirred up by his comment about it being poetic. Others might call it luck. But Dr. Savard had created ReMem because of a strong interest in spirituality. One of his beliefs was that luck was, as often as not, the silent hand of something important. Perhaps God or perhaps the universe. Which brought up the question that so much of the world had tried to ignore. If souls existed, was that proof of some higher power? People had mostly explained it away. Those who wanted to believe in reincarnation took it as proof. Those who wanted to believe it didn't exist claimed fraud or supernatural evil, and those who didn't want to believe in religion spoke of how energy couldn't be lost. Mirabel had mostly just not considered it. But while it had been subtle, she knew the only reason she wasn't currently inside a cell run by a ReMem subsidiary were her past life memories. And now the person hiding her was someone who had hidden her in a past life.
Do you believe in fate?
Mirabel asked. The man looked at her and said,
I never planned to use ReMem. The people I was around said it was diluting the souls of people. That they were trying to replace the real people. But a significant amount of them had done it. So when I was arrested, I was given a choice. ReMem as part of my probation or prison.
And it worked?
Mirabel said.
There are some things you can't understand unless you've seen them. I thought I understood the costs of what I believed. I didn't. Perhaps something big freed me from that evil.
So you think ReMem is a good thing?
I think it was good for me. And it was painful. And it's hurt a lot of people. But if there is fate, don't you think that power that created that fate would have known all of that?
I think I have to turn myself in,
Mirabel said. As she spoke, almost all of the memories from lives past rose up to show her why that was a terrible idea. The most fervent being Dr. Savard and Leah. But that was the answer to one last question. She understood where Dr. Savard and Leah fit into this puzzle, and she even knew some of the earlier past lives were contributing, but what about Mirabel? The answer was simple. It was her life. That meant she had to choose. But she wouldn't just walk into ReMem. She needed everyone to know what she knew, so that it would be harder to make her disappear. So she went to the TV studio. Normally, an 18-year-old girl wouldn't have drawn much attention, but ReMem had made her, at least temporarily, famous. Before stepping into the bright lights of the TV studio, Mirabel took a deep breath, steeling herself for the moment that could change everything. She was revealing a dangerous truth about one of the most powerful corporations in the world. Even with it public, it would still be dangerous. Yet it was not just the legacy of Dr. Savard or the echoes of Leah Katz that propelled her forward. It was the culmination of all the lives she'd lived, all the choices she'd made, converging into this singular instance of courage. The studio was abuzz with activity, technicians and producers moving with purpose, yet Mirabel's presence seemed to cast a spell of stillness, a momentary pause as they recognized her. She was guided to a seat across from an eager journalist, the studio lights casting a warm glow on her determined features.
As we go live,
The journalist began, the anticipation palpable in his voice.
we're joined by Mirabel Smith, the young woman whom ReMem claimed had the memories of a terrorist. But she claims it's something far more important. What is it that you want the world to know?
Mirabel leaned forward, her eyes locked on the camera, a conduit to the countless viewers on the other side.
ReMem has been hailed as a breakthrough, a way to bridge our past to our present, but at what cost? I stand before you as proof of its potential and its peril. I am, or was, Dr. Savard, the genius behind ReMem. I wanted to understand the world, but I didn't fully understand the cost. The cost for me was my life. But thanks to ReMem, we know that isn't the end. Perhaps that makes it the tool for enlightenment I envisioned. But it's also been made into a way to dredge up the darkest parts of our history for corporate profit.
She paused, allowing her words to sink in, her gaze unwavering.
But beyond the technology, beyond the controversies, lies a deeper truth. We are more than the sum of our past lives. Each memory, each life lived, is a piece of a larger puzzle. And while ReMem has unlocked these doors through dark deeds and even murder, it has also made us painfully aware of how much of our world is built on dark deeds. It is our responsibility to navigate these revelations with wisdom and compassion. We know the past far better than any generation. And it is painful. But the question is, are we going to repeat it?
The interview continued, Mirabel articulating her stance with a clarity and passion that was undeniable. She called for transparency, for ethical considerations in the use of ReMem, and for a collective reevaluation of how society integrates these newfound histories into their identities and who controlled it. As the interview wrapped up, Mirabel stood, a sense of liberation washing over her. She had done it. She had told Dr. Savard's truth on a national platform. The future was uncertain, but in this moment, she had ignited a conversation that could no longer be ignored. Author's note.
The past is a foreign nation, and in many ways, one that is far more different than the other nations of our time. Sometimes that is a comfort when we think about the many sins of our collective past. Perhaps that is why so many people want to hide from it, or to pretend that put into the same circumstances with the same life experiences, they would be entirely different and of course better. I'd like to think the same thing, to pretend that I am different and more moral in some fundamental way. But the more honest and the more useful understanding is the truth that I am not unique, that circumstances and the society around us shape us all. Let's make it better. Elton Gar.